It's from Perek Beis Halacha Yud. So the second chapter, the Rambam has been talking about a lot of things that are all usher midrabanan because it's maras ayin. It looks like you're doing something good for your field. Most of the things that we've been talking about were like removing rocks and stuff and stones so that your field will be prepared to be planted the next year. So we still have more things to do in just a few more things in regard to these maras ayin things. Halachiyat hamasakas adeh b'shvius m'meishu tzarich lavanim no telas al yonus menechas anogos ba'aretz. If you remove the field from the stones, the rocks from your field, so we talked about the sizes that you're allowed to. You could usually only take big ones because you need the stones. You could take the upper ones, but you have to leave the ones that are touching the earth. If you had some type of some big pile, no teles of stone, so I assume it would also this would include like gravel, like our all the Skokie alleys except for the Kesser Marv alley are gravel, and ours of course is concrete. But if you have like that type of gravel, a pile there, you can't move the ones that are touching the ground. No tosyanos menechas no goes far. But if underneath those small rocks, pebbles, whatever you want to call them, gravel, you have either a big rock or you have straw, so the land is still not ready to plow or to plant because there's not earth there because of the straw, then you're allowed to take all of those pebbles. So Kook says one opinion based on the Yerushalmi, it's also the Tosfos Yantiv, says that the ones that you're not allowed to remove are the ones that are like in the ground. You have to do some work to actually remove them from the ground. But if they're rocks that haven't been connected to the ground, so let's say I put some big rocks, or even let's just use an example of cinder bricks. This isn't exactly what the Mishnah is talking about, but if I put cinder bricks on my ground, a year or two later, it's still going to be pretty easy to pick them up. They haven't been like, they don't like stick to the ground. So something like that, you'd be allowed to remove. However, there's a different opinion. This opinion is the Tosos Hadashim, I don't know who that is, that you're never allowed to remove the bottom layer that's touching the ground, even though they're not really connected to the ground. Because whether it's really sticking to the ground or not, when you move it, it looks like you're preparing the ground. So then your Yitzchak and Malki Tzedek's opinion is when the Rambam at the end of the halacha says that if they're on top of straw or these rocks are on top of a big slab of a rock, then you could take the lower ones only if those are on top of the rocks or that big slab or on top of the straw. But if there's others, let's say next to it, because some spilled, as you know, that happens, you're not allowed to take those that spilled. Even though most of them were, or even if most of them had been on top of a slab or on top of straw, you're not allowed to take the ones that are on top of the ground. And some say, the Tosos Chadashim again and the Rash said that if some of them have straw or a slab underneath, then you're allowed to take all of them, since you see that by taking the rocks, you're not preparing the land for planting, since there's still a big slab underneath, or there's still a kash. So on the last point of the Rambam, the Rav Kook brought two opinions, whether if some of the stones of the gravel is on a slab of rock and some are not, two opinions whether you're allowed to take the ones that are even not on the slab. And the second opinion seems to make a lot of sense because everyone could see that your land is not ready for planting, since you still have a big slab on there. Okay, halacha yad aleph. lo Yamali Adam Gay Afar O Yisaknenu Ba'afar B'Neshim Sakinas Haaretz. You can't smooth out if you have a dip in your ground. You can't fill it up or fix it with other dirt or dust because you're fixing the land. But you can basically make a little lip around it. That you can put some dirt, not to fill it up, but to make a little lip around it. So if you're if you're sitting in front of the, this little depression, depression, and you could take a rock as you're sitting there. He doesn't literally say sitting, but it's something that's within the arm's reach. You're allowed to pick up a rock, even though we said last week all types of rules, and also just now another rule about taking rocks. If it's within less than a stone's throw, but just you could reach it, then you're allowed to take it and to make this lip. The Rabbi does not like this halacha because I'll read the Rabbi. I don't think you have the Rabbi in the paper there. The Rabbi said the Mishnah doesn't talk about this at all, but what the Mishnah does say, you're not allowed to make steps by the Geos Erev Shvius after the rain stops. So this halacha, I really didn't understand what it's talking about, but then I realized it means that if you have a place where the water flows, so there's some type of angled land, if you put bricks like this, the water can flow from the bricks, and then more water is going to get to your field and not get absorbed in the ground. That's what that Mishnah is talking about. I think we mentioned that when we learned the Mishnah. So that's what the Mishnah talks about. So the Mishnah says you're not allowed to build steps over that Erev Shvius once the rainy season is over because you're fixing it for Shmitta year. But you could build it on the Shmitta year after the rain has stopped because it's being fixed for the after Shmitta year. And if you do it during the 6th year, it looks like you're getting the field ready that it'll be irrigated well for Shmitta. So that's not okay. And then it says, Lo Yismach Ba'afar. You're not allowed to use dirt in laying these steps. Aval Osa Osam Haaretz, but you can make a lip. And any stone that you're able to just stick your hand out and put it right there, you're allowed to move it. So the Ravid says, so what the Mishnah is talking about is talking about the steps that are by this stream of water, or in Israel sometimes you only have the stream when it's rainy. So that's talking about when you're building them. So lo yasan ba'afar nation machir l'zriya. You can't put stones around these. You can't use dirt around these stones, I guess, to make them flat, because then things can grow right next to it very well. Aval osahu chayetz perish b'avanim. When it says you can make a lip, it means you're allowed to make a lip with stones. And when any stone that if you're able to stick your hand when you're in the Rishus Harabim, and you can take it from someone else's field, you can take it in, it's not considered geza. Ubonaba, you could build with it. But you can't take it out of your own field because if you take out the stone, some grasses, whatever, can grow there. So the Ravid, what exactly is the Ravid's question? So the Kesemish understands the Ravid question is that when you're building the steps here, you can't fill in dirt over there to make it more smooth. So I thought when I saw steps, I thought it literally was steps and the water is just going to drop down them. Whether he actually means you're going to make like a slide, from the way the Kesef Mishnah explains it, it almost sounds like according to the Rabbi, you're almost making a slide, even though it calls it madregos, which we translate as steps. So you would need dirt in order to make it smooth as a slide, I think. But without the Rabbi, you could still say the Rambam means you might need to put a little bit of dirt underneath it so that the rock that you're putting there will lay flat. You could learn it that way. Mhm. Right. We'll see in a few halacha. Does it stop erosion also? Does it stop erosion also? So we're going to see in a few halachos that they did have fields that were sloped. We're going to see in the next parak. Whether how many of them, I don't know. What other places in the world do, and at different historical times, I don't know. But like 150 years ago in Ireland, the poor Catholics who had their potato patches, they were definitely on slopes. But again, that's different climate and different stuff than Israel, right? So, but within some of the terraces, there could have been a little bit of a slope. But here, the way I understand is that the water is going to be flowing down. So the water is not going to flow if it's flat. So you need to have the slope there so the water will flow downstream. But I understand your point there. So I don't know that does, but you could say that the Rabbi is also arguing that the Mishnah didn't say anything about smoothing up a hole in your field. Now, how big the hole would be, I don't know. And what's the benefit of making a lip around it? Again, I'm not sure. But that's the Rambam says, and the Ravid does seem to be on more of the correct side because the Mishnah, as I recall, doesn't talk about smoothing up a depression in your field. If you remember in the farmhouse near Kastner and the alley, there was like a pitcher's mound over there for some reason. And when we used to park in grounds, so once someone's car got stuck there. It wasn't a pitcher's mound, but the size of it was almost like a pitcher's mound. So most people didn't park there once, maybe it was night, someone parked there and the car got stuck. So Rav Kook says the Rash and the Bartanura say that you're allowed to make these steps for those streams. So those are talking about the depressions where water gathers, meaning I assume that it's talking about water flowing. He's talking about it's more like a pond type thing. And you just want the waters to collect there. So whether it's some type of step for you to go down there a little bit, and that, I mean, I don't know why you wouldn't just have a bucket at the end of the rope, but it's talking about it sounds more of a standing pool water. But the basis Yisrael in the Pas Shulchan says that this is only talking. We're going to talk about this more next week. I mean, in the next parak in a few minutes. This is talking about when the Beis Hamikdash was standing, because then there was a halacha of Tosefes Shmitta, Tosefes Shvius as a stringency after the previous time. So after the rainy season was over during the 6th year, if you would build something like this, it looks like you're preparing for the 7th, for Shmitta, and all the things that the Mishnayos talked about in the first chapter of the Mishnayos, all the things about when you're not allowed to plow the trees around the trees and stuff like that. That was before Shmitta. That Tosefes Shmitta, that only applies. The Rambam's going to say at the beginning of chapter 3 that applies only when the Beis Hamikdash was standing. But nowadays, we can do everything right up to Erev Shmitta. And I think I mentioned my year in Kirby Avna, I didn't understand why they were mowing the lawn on Erev Rosh Hashanah. There's better things to do on Rosh Hashanah than mowing the lawn. But then I realized, probably took me a few weeks, that because it was Shmitta, so that in order to minimize the stuff they did on Shmitta, it was important for them, they felt, I guess, to mow the lawn on Erev Rosh Hashanah, because it wasn't Shmitta yet. When I say lawn, it wasn't like a well-manicured lawn. It was just, the grass they have over there. No, there was not planting fields. No. So what? So whether the laws of Shmitta apply to it, probably not. So, so this was permitted to do on Shmita because you're not fixing it only for Shmita. You could do it on the 7th year after the rain ends in preparation for the 8th year. But nowadays that we don't have to add to Shmita year. We don't have to start before Shmita. So just like there's no prohibition to do work on the 6th year, even though it's to help the 7th year, and the main thing is for the 7th year. But nowadays we only consider when the work was done, not when the work is going to help for. So therefore, we don't so because of that, we're not going to allow you to do it during the 7th year, even if the goal is for it to help on the 8th year. So what the Rambam is saying is talking about Bisman Haba, is talking about when Shmita would be Midiraisa. But nowadays, the Rav Kook is saying, based on this on the Pasuk Shulchan, you wouldn't be allowed to do it on the 6th year. You would be allowed to do it on the 6th year because there's no Tosefet Shmitas, and you're not allowed to do it on the 7th year because we don't allow any working that's going to improve the land on Shmita. Even though it's not going to help you on Shmita, it's not going to help you till the 8th year. Mm-hmm. Right, I understand. So let's say this is actually very similar to Shmita because the Gemara actually compares it. In the beginning of Moed Katan, it talks about certain types of buildings or plantings on Chol Hamoed. So Chol Hamoed, it's a machlokas rishonim if malach on Chol Hamoed is prohibited midiraisa on the Torah level, but the Torah gave over to the Chachamim which actions were forbidden on Chol Hamoed and which were permitted, or if malach on Chol Hamoed is only prohibited on rabbinically. So there is a big analogy between Shmita nowadays and Chol Hamoed, which is the Gemara says. So let's say a house was started collapsing, you would be allowed to do that on Chol Hamoed. So the question is, when it's a terrace and it's not a living place, would you be allowed to fix that during Shmita? So because people don't actually live there, I don't know. I understand your question. So it sounds like if it completely got swept away, you wouldn't be able to fix it because. So let's say it's starting to go. That would be the question. So like a couple racks from the top slipped or whatever. So you're going to start losing the terrace, and if you would repair it, then you're going to save the terrace. So that would probably depend on that shaila. But then again, maybe it's not because the house is worse because people are living in a house, and here it's not living. So I'm not sure. So there is a basis. So the Gemara itself does compare some of these things about Shmita Bisman Hazeh to Chol Hamoed, but again, I don't know if it's exactly analogous since people live in a house, but they don't live on the terrace. But it's a fair question. I don't know the answer. Okay, so for rabbinic work, which is prohibited because Marasayan, people are going to think that you're preparing your field. They were not lenient nowadays, even when it's recognizable that you're doing it for the 8th year. But while it's still the rainy season, it's certainly forbidden to build these steps, whether it's around a pool or whether it's to let the water flow. You're certainly not allowed to do it during the Shmita year. Then he quotes the Rash that you're not allowed to make he actually says it here, mechitza ma'akeves ba'afar, which seems to be called a retaining wall, because mechitza ma'akeves is to hold something back. So I guess we would call it a retaining wall to keep the water there, not so they wouldn't get out. So not exactly, because this seems to be a retaining wall for the water. You're asking more about the terrace. It's to hold the dirt in. So it's not exactly the same thing. So it's forbidden to put mortar between the stones, also for this retention wall. And you're not allowed to you can only stack stones on top of each other without using any mortar or pitch or anything like that. And then the Rash also brings an opinion that whoever builds a fence or anything next to your field, and we're going to learn more about this in the next halacha, I think, you're allowed to take any stone, even small stones that you wouldn't be allowed to move from your field, like we mentioned previously, as long as it's very close to where you're building, to the fence. And you're not going to exert yourself, meaning you're wherever you are, whether you're on your knees or wherever you're working, you could reach it. You're allowed to use it for that fence. But we're going to see in the next halacha, or in two halachos, about building a fence. It's not always allowed, which is a little bit of something I wouldn't have thought. And we're not worried that it looks like you're fixing your field, since everyone sees that you're building the fence right there. They know you're just taking the stone for the fence. But if it's more than just what you could reach and take, then you're not allowed to take it unless it's one of those very large stones that are 2 people to carry, etc. And the Ravid says, actually from this Ravid that we just read, if it's your field, you're never allowed to take the stone, even if it's right next to where you're working. And you're only allowed to take it from your neighbor's field. And the Chiddush isn't Shmitta, because we learned last week you could clear someone else's field as long as you're not clearing it all the way, or it's machlokas. But the Chiddush is that it's not considered stealing. You can take it without permission. And the Rash also brings an opinion that when you're making these steps or the slide on Shmitta after the rainy season, you can't cover it with dirt on top of it. So I guess some people it would help bring the water that way, but if you put dirt on top, you could plant there also, so you're certainly not allowed to put the dirt on top of it. Yud Beis. So again, something that is clear, and I've mentioned it in certain contexts, is that I don't know exactly how the grape people prune the vines and how they harvest it. It's important to know, to understand historically how they've done it and how they do it now, and just to understand how the halachos work. So same thing about the plots of land. I mean, we'd have to know, and I think that Rav Rimon has spent time with these farmers, especially the ones from Gush Katif, and was learning a lot of the actual agriculture stuff that they did, and it informed his psakim in some of these areas, which is the right thing to do. You see how they do it. Now, the extreme is, I think, Rav Moshe's cousin, Professor Chaim Soloveitchik, went and learned how they made barrels of wine 1,000 years ago, barrels for wine 1,000 years ago, because of he was always been interested in the Heterim in Ashkenaz, in the French-German region over there, about dealing the business dealings with non-Jews. So he, I think, became an expert in how they made the barrels, because some people had said that the barrels in the Middle Ages then, in the 1100s, 1200s, time of Rabbeinu Tam, were worse than the time, let's say, in the second base of Mikdash, because in Europe they're making it out of wood and they leaked more. So if wine would leak out, a pagan could have let some of that leaked wine, be an offering for the Avodah Zarah. Whereas I think in like the Roman times, or in the times of the second base of Mikdash, they had barrels that were much less leaky. So I mean, he went to an extreme is his way to learn about all the details about how to make barrels in the Middle Ages. Halacha Yud Beis. Avnei Kasaf. Hemen Tos Beis Ala Kasaf Mutar Levin Mikamakam Bein Misechaver Bein Misadehu. The shoulders, stones of shoulder, which means you need 2 people, or you take 2 or 3 on your shoulder, you're allowed to bring them from any place, whether it's your field or whether it's someone else's field. If you're a contractor, you could take big stones, whether it's the one you're working on or whether it's one that you're not working on. So the Yerushalmi, Rav Kook says from the Yerushalmi, the contractor here is able to bring even from his own field. Did we do this last week? It looks so familiar. We don't worry that people might think that you're clearing your field because we mentioned everyone knows you're a bricklayer. You're taking bricks because you have a job. You're not doing it to clear your field. So this contractor, we're talking about the Kabbalah. So some say it's just someone who has taken a job to build buildings. And the Rabbi says that he's the one building this lip or retaining wall, which we are allowed to build because it follows after this previous halacha. So he's learning the context is the same context. It's a continuation of the previous halacha. So it's talking about he's allowed to use such stones to build it. And the Rambam in the Pirsha Mishnah mentions that this is talking about a sharecropper. So since it's not his land, he's allowed to move these stones because the Chachamim only forbade you to move smaller stones if it's your own field and not from someone else's field. So last week we were talking about big stones that took two people to lift, I think, and here we're talking about they're big stones, but they're not that big. You could put 2 or 3 on your shoulder at a time and carry them. Yud Gimel. Peretashahi so suga ba'afar. If you had a breach in your fence, let's say, and it was filled with dirt, if it's not providing a stumbling block, if it's not impeding the people, the public, meaning it could be abutting your neighbor's field, a different neighbor's field, or it could be abutting the street, the Rosh Hashanah. So if it's by your neighbor's field, no big deal, just leave it. If it's by the Rosh Hashanah, if it's not impeding the traffic on the street, then you have to leave it. You're not allowed to build it with stones. But if it was impeding the public, or it was completely breached and it wasn't even filled with dirt, you're not allowed to fix that on Shmitta. And the Rabbi says that you're always allowed to fix a breach in your fence, and it doesn't matter if it is impeding even if it's not impeding the traffic, whether it was previously, even if it had been previously filled in with dirt, you're allowed to fix it. But from the Yerushalmi, Rav Kook says that it seems more like the Rambam's opinion, not like the Rabbi's opinion. Yadala, the last halach in the parak, Asulo livnos getter b'shviyas bein tzadeo l'sechaver. You're not allowed to build a fence on Shmitta between your and your neighbor's field. Avabona gutter beino bein Rosh Hashanah, but you're allowed to build a fence between you and the public domain. Umoter lahamik al hasela umote safar v'tzover b'sof sadeo k'dav kalamami zeva. And you're allowed to dig until you reach, I guess, the bedrock, we would call it. And you can take all that dirt and pile it in your field, just like people who are getting fertilizer ready would make piles. If you're digging out a well or a cistern or a ditch on Shmitta, you're allowed to pile the dirt in your field like anyone who normally digs. So obviously you're dealing with dirt over here, but to make, whether it's going to be a cistern or a well or a ditch, you're certainly not making something flat and nice for planting. So I guess there was we're not worried about Marasayan. We're not worried that it looks like you're preparing your field. Now, one thing I'm wondering, because why wouldn't you be allowed to build for a fence between your property and your neighbor's property? So maybe there is some issue, and these would come up at the beginning of Bava Basra, but it seems that it's important to know where your property, the boundary of your property. I mean, there's, I think, 2 lavim, 2 different losa says about, or I think there's a special thing, you're not allowed to move the property line, And I think Rashi brings, whether it's a Gemara or a Sifri or whatever, that there's two lavim. It's regular low sigzal or low tignovu. And then there's a second because you're stealing the other person's land. And it's a second lav of moving your property line. So it's important to have your property line. So I'm not sure if maybe this is here so that if you know where your property line is, you're able to know exactly where you're going to plant. So if the problem is having a fence to nicely mark your property, it's going to help you plow and plant better the next year. I don't know if that's part of the issue. Rav Kook says there's a doubt that which you're allowed to pile the dirt in your field, like the people who are fertilizing. So when you're building the field, that's definitely it mean it follows the same rules of depots and storage facilities for the manure that we spoke about last week. So if it's after the time when the normal fertilizers fertilize the field, you're allowed to pile it in certain ways, in certain amounts. But if it's while they're still fertilizing, you're not allowed to move the fertilizer to your field at all. So does this mean that it's like when the Rambam says it's Keder Chamezavim, does that mean the exact same laws of the fertilizers apply here? Or no, this is dirt and that's fertilizer. So I'm allowed to do it any time of Shmitta, even if other people are fertilizing. I'm not fertilizing, I have dirt. So I'm allowed to pile it in my field, even though if it was manure, I wouldn't be allowed to move it right now. Okay, chapter 3. So now from these halachos that are usher because of Maras Ayin in halacha Beis, the Rambam here in halacha Gimel is talking about what I think most of these halachos are in Perek Aleph of the Mishnah, is things that we're usually not allowed to do for Tosefes Shmita. So just like we add a few minutes to Shabbos, we also, there's halacha Moshe Sinai, we'll see, not to do certain halachos before Shmita starts. So halacha Aleph, Avodas Haaretz b'shana shisha shloshim yom samach l'shvius asur halacha Moshe Sinai. Working the land during the 6th year, but 30 days within Shmita, so during the month of Elul, it's forbidden as an oral tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu that Moshe received at Har Sinai. Because you are preparing it for the 7th year. The davar zeb is manche Beis Hamikdash kayam hu shenamar mishanas and Rapiya Shmuel. And this is only also when the Beis Hamikdash is standing, and that is from the oral tradition. The Gazru Chachamim shelo yu chorshim stei ha'ilan erev shviyas bisman Hamikdash ela atzeres. And this is the mission of the first Mishnah. The Chachamim made a gzera that you're not allowed to plow in a tree field during the 6th year, during the Beis Hamikdash from Shmita, only until Shavuos time. But once it's after Shavuos, it's already preparing for Shmita, and there's the Isra of Tosefes Shvius. Ustei alavan ad Pesach. And for the white field, meaning the fields that don't have trees growing, so it turns white from the heat, the grasses, whatever that are growing there, turn white from the heat, you're only allowed to plow those until Pesach time. So by now, well, during the 6th year, now it's already the 7th year, but at this time last year, it would already be usher to plow those fields. But when there is no Beis Hamikdash, you're allowed to work up to Erev Rosh Hashanah Shmita, just like the Torah law. You don't have to worry about the oral tradition, it seems, or certainly not the Xeros. Well, actually, the oral law tells us only when the Beis Hamikdash is standing, so it doesn't apply now. Okay. Rav Kook says that which it says the reason is a reason within this oral tradition that you can't do work within 30 days of Shmita because you're fixing the land for Shmita. It seems that it's that the reason, because is the reasons for mitzvahs important? No, a lot of times mitzvahs reasons are not important. We know that King Shlomo thought that he understood the reasons. He said, I could marry a lot of wives and I could accrue a lot of money, but it's not going to sway my heart. And then what happened? They swayed his heart. The many wives swayed his heart. So it's not good to have a reason. But here, so Rav Kook is mentioning, some people say the Rambam mentions the reason because by telling us the reason, it can give us a gader, guidance of what specifically is forbidden to do because of this halacha Moshe Sinai and what's not. So anything that's done because of preparing the land for Shmita, that is also forbidden before Shmita starts, whether it's plowing or pruning trees, but harvesting, whether it's harvesting something, a grain, or harvesting from a tree, that is not a problem of preparing the land. So therefore, that's not included in Tosefes Shvius. So it comes up, it makes a lot of sense, but because remember, we learned there's 4 Isurim that are allowed, you're not allowed to do Midiraisa. You're not allowed to plant seeds or trees. Excuse me. You can't plant seeds and you can't prune trees because that's the way that you, or vines, because that's the way that you help them grow. And you can't harvest grain and you can't harvest from the grapevines or the olive trees. So planting or getting ready for planting has to do with is preparing the land, but harvesting what's already on the tree isn't preparing it for the next year. That's just taking care of this year. So he's saying that the harvest prohibitions do not apply in Tosefes Shvius. It's only the things that would help planting. Now, in regard to plowing, I think we mentioned at the beginning, there's a machlokas rishonim, if plowing, even though it's not one of the 4 things that, let's say, Rashi mentioned, but the pasuk in Mishpatim talks about not plowing your field. So Rav Kook is going to have a little discussion about this. So what about so even things that are improving land for Shvius, the Rash, and the Rash I think quotes Rabbi Tam that only the things that are usher from the Torah level, but only things that are usher and Shmita that are rabbinic also were not included in the prohibition of pre-Shmita, with Tosefes Shmita, when Tosefes Shvius. And these opinions hold that plowing is usher min Torah. So therefore, you're not allowed to plow before Shmita either, because that's what the Mishnah is talking about, plowing in the tree fields, the orchards. So they would necessarily have to hold that plowing is also prohibited. When it says 4, it's 4 plus plowing. Then Rabbi Tam, also brought by the Rash, says that you're allowed to plant during the time of Tosefes Shvius. And it's not usher by itself to plant in the 30 days before Rosh Hashanah, except the only problem is Marasayan, because people will think that if you're planting during this time, planting must be only one of the rabbinic prohibitions, but it's not. So therefore, it's okay. And the Rash also says over there that planting is also on Shmita from a Kavachomer. That if pruning, which is only like a derivative work of planting, is forbidden, certainly planting itself is forbidden, and therefore we shouldn't be allowed to plant on Tosefes Shvius during the period of Tosefes Shvius. Now, I was wondering why in Yerushalayim, or in certain neighborhoods in Yerushalayim, they were planting trees within the year before Shmita. I mean, we did see, well, we are going to see soon, I don't know if we're going to have time today, that young trees you're allowed to take certain care of during Shmita so they don't die. But again, in those cases, they weren't planting baby trees. These were trees that came from a nursery. So they've been growing for a few years already, but they transplanted them before Shmita. So whether the municipality doesn't ask the Rabbanut about these things, or whether it is mutter because it's not considered a new tree, but we'll see. The Rambam Paskins, like the Mishnah, I think had 3 opinions. If a new tree is for 7 years or for 3 years, or however many people, Rabbi Kiva, I think some interpret Rabbi Kiva it's only 1 year, that's newly planted. Whether it's a transplanted tree like that, what the halacha is, we have to see what the contemporary poskim say. I haven't looked into that yet. It's not exactly what we're talking about here. And according to this opinion of Kook, ends up that you wouldn't be allowed to plant seeds during Tosefes Shvius, even if it's not going to fix the land or part of those trees. But it's usher not because of preparing the land, but because it itself is a prohibited act on the Torah level during the Beis Hamikdash time. Beis. Ezo Hisdei Ilan. So what's an orchard? A field of trees. Kol Shlosha Ilanos L'Beis Ha'ah. 3 trees in the area of a Beis Ha'ah. Whether it's an acre, whatever, we're just calling it an acre just so we can understand it. Whether it's just a shade tree that doesn't grow fruit, or whether it is a fruit tree, even if they're owned by 3 different people, we could imagine that the non-fruit bearing trees are fig trees. If they're able to produce, or the size of these trees if they would be fig trees, they would make 60 mana worth of a pressed date loaf. They used to put the dates together in like a round cake thing. Then you can plow the entire field, the entire acre, because of those 3 trees. As long as they're far enough from each other that the team of oxen or whatever that have the yoke and have the plow connected to them would be able to go in between them. And we'll see that that's 4 amos. Okay, so Rav Kook says the Rash and Rav Yitzchak B'Malki Tzedek, based on the Yerushalmi, says when they're owned by 3 people and you're allowed to plow the whole field because they're owned by 3 people, that's better. That's a better heter than if it was only owned by 1 person. Because if it's 3 people, if the 3 trees in the acre are owned by 1 person, you're only allowed to plow until Shmitta, till Shavuos time on Erev Shvius. When it's owned by 3 different people, you're allowed to do it all the way until Rosh Hashanah. However, the Gra and the Tosos Yantif and the Rush say, no, you can't say that there's a better heter for when they're owned by 3 different people than if they're owned by 1 person. Even though they combine and you're allowed to plow it, you're only allowed to plow it up until Shavuos, just like if it was owned by 1 person. So when it's owned by 3 people, the 3 trees are owned by 3 different people. There is an opinion that makes it more lenient, and you're able to plow the whole thing until Rosh Hashanah. However, some poskim say no, you're still only allowed to plow it until Shavuos. Certainly, if the land is owned by but the trees are owned by someone, and the karka, the land is owned by someone else, they also combine, and you're able to plow the whole acre. It seems, based on certain things from the Yerushalmi and the Pnei Moshe, which is an Achron commentary on the Yerushalmi, passing like Rab, says that this is only true in the 3 trees that are in the acre. You can plow the whole acre is only if they were scattered, but if they were made in a line, you're not allowed to. They don't combine. You're not allowed to plow the acre, and you're only allowed to plow around each individual tree to help each tree, but you can't do the whole acre. And the Ridvaz explains to Yerushalmi that it depends if there's enough space, which that the 2 oxen or whatever with the yoke and the plow on them to go in between them, you're allowed to plow them even if they're in a line. But you're not allowed to do them if they're in a line, is if they are close to each other, that the team of oxen would not be able to go through them. So one of the reasons that we are allowed you to plow the whole thing is hold on. What's he saying here? Okay, I'm not sure what he's saying here. I could read it in 2 opposite ways, but it has to do with the fact that how far the roots are extending out from the tree. And I'm not sure if he's saying here, so you can plow even beyond that, because you're not really helping the tree once it's beyond the region of the roots. I'm not sure if he's saying that or if he's saying the opposite. But if the roots, I guess, are far from farther than the amount that you're allowed to plow, even if they're in a line, you're allowed to plow, I guess, because the we're just going to finish this up. So even if they're in a line, but the roots go further, you can plow further because that's gonna help. And so, okay, so here's where you asked about the what was the word? The terrace. Some say that it doesn't matter if they're on flat land that doesn't go up or down, or even if the field is sloping downwards and the trees are on top, or if the trees are down and the land is on top. Since there is, even it's a little bit far-fetched, but plowing the land is going to help the trees, you're allowed to plow the whole thing, even if it's on a different level. Either the trees are above or the trees are below. If there's less than 3 trees in the acre, Rashi's opinion of Baba Basra that you're not allowed to plow the whole field. You're only allowed to plow around each individual tree, which is the amount of a grape picker, and his basket is outside of him. And it's a certain distance. But Rashi and Sukkah says you would be able to do, if you split an acre into 3, you can make that much, you could plow that much around it. And the Tosefta says that the amount between the tree is that the team can go in between the trees. That's Arba Amos, but they can't be closer than that. If they're closer than that, then you can only plow around each one's needs, not the whole field. Okay, we really have to end here. So, okay, so just another important point. At the end here, so Rav Kook mentioned, so the Rambam in the Parsha Mishnah says the amount that the trees are making a kikar tvela, the certain amount of the fig cake, that's each tree has to make 60, this amount of fig. And then the Mishnah seems to say if there's between 3 and 9, as long as all together they make that amount, that doesn't apply. But the Yitzchak ben Malki Tzedek says if 3, you don't need each of those trees to make that much. You can have them. So this is an important machlokas. So if you're only allowed to plow them, if each of the trees can make that fig cake, or if the 3 altogether can make that certain amount of figs. So that's an important distinction between these. And so even if it's not a fig tree, we would say if it was a fig tree of this size, what would its expected yield be?